Now, I don't want a show of hands, but have you ever been in jail? I said I didn't want a show of hands. I've been in jail a few times. And as you can imagine, I went in there because I was a minister helping somebody out. In one of the churches I served, we had a jail ministry, and I would get calls when anybody needed some help, and I would go down to the jail, and I had a card that would get me in, and fortunately it would get me out. It's a frightening place. I mean, just to hear the doors clank behind you and be locked is scary. And you think, what happens if there was an earthquake? What if there was a fire? How do I get out of this place? And then you go through the next door, and the next door, and they just keep closing behind you and locking. And one time I got a call to come and see this young woman. And it's one of those events that you probably will never forget. I will never forget. And I got through the doors, and we came into a spot where they were going to bring her in, and they brought her in. And here comes this skinny, emaciated, young 19-year-old woman. And she was a heroin addict, but she was in jail because of prostitution. And you just have to mention the hurt that was going through her, the embarrassment, the pain, and the confusion and the worry that she's going through. But she had a question for me, and she wanted to know from the Bible. She said, well, I have a 5-year-old. And it doesn't take long to realize this girl got pregnant when she was 13 years old. And she had been married, and now she's divorced, and she wants to know, can I get married again? That was her question. Can I get married again? And I went to a passage in Matthew 19th chapter. I just read it to her, and she said, oh, I don't need to talk to you anymore. I said, what? And she goes, well, there's the answer right there. And we parted. But over the years, as that memory comes up in my mind, I wonder how I could have done a better job. And I thought, did I do that like Jesus would have done it? What would Jesus have done if he were there? And I know he would have done a lot better job than me, but he would have seen the absurdity of the situation. And it was absurd. Years later, I was in another jail, another prisoner, and this guy was a serial killer. And he had just murdered somebody. And they asked me to go in and talk to him. And so I was visiting with him. But let's just suppose in all this that he has a question for me. And his question is something like, do I have to go to church every Sunday? You think, what an absurd question, man. You've got a lot bigger problems than whether you're going to church every Sunday. You've just murdered several people, and you just got caught red-handed the last time. And then I think about this young girl. The absurdity. She is thinking, can I get married again? And she says, you got bigger things on your plate than this. You're a heroin addict. You have a little boy that needs a mom. You're selling your body. You're involved in prostitution. You got all these things. You need to know that God loves you. That Jesus can give you healing, that he could take all these hurts and all the pain of your past, and he could take that away from you, and he can heal you from that and help you with that, and he could get you through this addiction and put you back in a right frame of mind where you could be a mom again and a good contributor to our society. And you say to me, well, Ron, how would you know that God could do that? What makes you so sure? Well, here's how I know. Because he's done it thousands and thousands of times before. And he continues to do it. But it's that, to look at this woman like Jesus would was something I wasn't able to do at the time. I was in my early 20s. I just looked at it as an academic thing. She asked me a question. I had a Bible answer for her. But I never saw her. I never saw the pain that she was dealing. I never saw the struggle that she was going through. And I think I might have handled it different now. And it helps me to understand Jesus' outlook on things and how Jesus saw things. And Isaiah, he tells us the heart of Jesus perhaps better than any prophet. And we're going to look at Isaiah, the 42nd chapter this morning, especially verses 1 through 4. And that's where we're going to begin by reading those verses. And he says, "Behold, my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry out or raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not be disheartened or crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands will wait expectantly for his law." Behold, God's servant. That's what this lesson's about. Let's take a look at God's servant. How did Jesus deal with people such as that young woman? How does he deal with us? How does he deal with those around him? Here is, behold, this is God's servant. This is the first of 4 servant songs in Isaiah. We call them the servant songs. He has this poetry, this song about the servant. Here's the first one in chapter 42. The second one is going to be in chapter 49. And then there's one in chapter 50, and then one in chapter 52 that goes through 53. And that one in 52 and 53, he starts using the personal pronouns, he. And this is the thing. This is a 2-part song here in chapter 42. The first part of the song, God speaks of the servant. This is verses 1 through 4. Verses 5 and following, he speaks to the servant. And Isaiah, as he's done and as we've seen, he weaves all these themes together. As you weave one color after another to make a certain color of clothing, to make it more beautiful, he weaves these things, these ideas back and forth. And he's been weaving this idea of a servant. And usually when Isaiah talks about a servant, he's talking about the nation of Israel. He calls the nation of Israel my servant. He did that last time we got together in chapter 41. He talked about it being his servant. In chapter 42, verses 18 through 25, we'll talk of Israel being his servant. Chapter 44, Israel is his servant. But now he says, here is my servant. And he's talking about something totally different. Here is my servant. And he might note that the translators have capitalized those, my servant. Because they're trying to tell us something. They're saying he's not talking about Israel any longer. He's talking about a particular person. He's talking about a special person, my servant. He's talking about someone that's divine. You think, well, how do they know that? How do they know this is not just the nation of Israel as he's been speaking about before? How do they know this is divine? Well, here's how they know. Because Matthew's going to quote this passage in Matthew, the 12th chapter, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. And so they know this is a special servant. And he begins with the word behold, behold. And it's ironic because the last verse of the 41st chapter ends with the word behold. Behold, all of them are false. He's talking about the idols. Remember the courtroom scene we looked at last week. And he says, look, behold, all these are a waste. They're worthless. They're wind. They're empty. And now he says, but behold. The word behold is, look at this. Pay attention here. Behold my servant. It's going to be a lot different than these empty, useless, worthless idols. Behold my servant. And God's Spirit is going to be on them. And that's what he says there in verse 2. My Spirit, I'm going to put my Spirit upon him, which tells us that he's going to be just like God. And we've seen God. And God's talked about this as we go through Isaiah. He says, you know, I'm going to uphold you with my right arm, and I'm going to be a shepherd. These contrasting images. The right arm, I have power, but I have tenderness as a shepherd. And he says he's going to be like that. He's going to be strong and mighty, but he's going to be tender as well. And he's not going to be crying out in the street or raising his voice. He's not going to be loud. He's not going to be shouting people down in the streets. He's not going to be like a lot of the street evangelists you see screaming at people as they run by. He's not going to be like that at all. He's not going to call attention to himself by yelling and hollering. But note verse 3, and this is what I want us to focus on. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. I want you to try to imagine this in your mind. A bruised reed. Think about a reed. You know, a reed, you see them alongside the lakes and the rivers. A reed, a strong, tall stick. And he says, here's this strong, proud stick, and maybe an animal's gone by and it's broke it in half. And now that piece of reed is just barely hanging on. It's not going to take much to break it off the rest of the way. It's been injured, it's been wounded, and it doesn't going to take a lot to break it. Or take a look at this dimly burning wick. It's just barely aflame. There's just barely a light there. It's just smoldering. It's fainting. It's almost gone. And Isaiah said, this servant is going to be so gentle. He won't even break that bruised reed or extinguish that dimly burning wick. Jesus is going to be so meek and gentle. Going to Matthew, the 11th chapter for just a moment and taking a look at how Matthew is going to use these words of Isaiah. In Matthew 11th chapter, you have this marvelous invitation by Jesus. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Such a gentle invitation. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. When I was younger, I was reading this real fast, and when I was preaching, I'm saying, come to me, all you who are weird. But, you know, that works too. You know, all of you who are troubled, all you who are working hard at life and it's just not working for you, all you're weary, you're heavy laden, well, come, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and I'm humble and gentle in heart, and you'll find rest for your soul. Such marvelous sweetness here. You know, that woman in the jail, she needed someone to come to her with this kind of invitation. And so many others need to hear that he's ready to take you back. I know you've had a hard time in life, and you've been wounded by life, and you've done some things yourself to yourself, but I'm still here, and I want you to come back, and I'm going to be gentle with you. You know, there's no chapter breaks in the original. You realize that. In chapter 11, this would have gone right into chapter 12. In chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, it says at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath. But he said to them, have you not read what David did when he became hungry, and he and his companions, how he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priest alone? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would have not condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. The Pharisees had accused Jesus and the disciples of harvesting grain on the Sabbath day, because as they were going through the wheat field, they were taking the grain off and eating it as they walked along, and they said, this is not lawful, you can't do it. And Jesus responds with 3 examples. He says, don't you remember what David did? And he goes back to 1 Samuel, the 21st chapter. He appeals to King David. And then secondly, he appeals to the priests who are in service to the temple. He says, they work, and it's on a Sabbath day. And then the third thing he appeals to is a prophet Hosea, and he quotes Hosea here. Notice we have a prophet and a priest and a king that he appeals to. And he says, but, verse 6, but there's something greater here. There's someone greater here than this. And this is the first of 3 greaters. There's someone greater here than the temple. And then in verse 41, there's someone greater here than Jonah. And then in verse 42, someone greater here than Solomon. So why is it okay for him to do this on the Sabbath? Who is this? And he says there in verse 8, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's equating himself here to God. I've not violated anything. We've not violated anything. And now we continue this story, and you get the scene. You get the picture a little bit of what's going on, the animosity between the Pharisees and Jesus and his disciples. And we begin here in verse 9. Departing from there, he went into their synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. And they questioned Jesus, asking, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. And he said to them, what man is there among you who has a sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? So then is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and it was restored to normal like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him as to how they might destroy him, put him to death. But Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there. Many followed him, and he healed them all and warned them not to tell who he was. This was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. Here's our passage. Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He'll not quarrel, nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A battered reed he will not break off, and his smoldering wick he will not put out, until he leads justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope. Here's a guy with a withered hand. He's crippled. You know, he can't do most of the jobs that were available in those days without this hand. He couldn't be a fisherman. He couldn't be a carpenter. He couldn't be a soldier. And so his livelihood is affected. He's severely being affected by this. And notice the question is not, can you heal this man? It's, is it lawful to do it on a Saturday? Is it right to do it on a Saturday? They never questioned Jesus as to whether he could do it or not. They knew he could. And this is an interesting thing just to pull over for just a second, just to realize, you know, none of Jesus' miracles were ever questioned by those who saw them, witnessed them. Nobody said that wasn't a real miracle. I see there was a little trick here. They realized something had happened. And here the question is not, well, can you do it? Of course he can do it. They've seen him do it. They've seen him do all these miracles. Is it right? Is it lawful to do this on a Saturday? And Jesus says, well, if you have a sheep, if it's your sheep, and it falls into a pit, aren't you going to go get your sheep and pull them out? Well, of course you are. And Jesus is basically saying, this is my man. My man has a problem here. And so my man, I'm going to heal him. This is my man. I could do this on a Sabbath. And so they sought to kill him. And Jesus, it said, took and parted from there, and he continued to heal and to heal and to heal people. And Matthew then quotes Isaiah 42, this passage here. Behold my servant whom I have chosen. And this describes Jesus' ministry. It really describes Jesus' ministry. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not extinguish. And just think through the Gospels. A woman comes to Jesus. She's actually coming to a well in Samaria to get some water. And he starts a conversation with her. He says, can I have a drink? What are you doing talking to me? You see, this woman's coming out here by herself. You got to realize she's an outcast. Why doesn't she come with all the women in the morning when they all come to get water? Because they don't want her around. This woman has had some trouble in her life. She's had some problems in her life. And Jesus starts talking about living water. And she tries to change the topic. You know, you hear people say that in Jerusalem we should worship. My people say here, which is right. And he gets through all that and says, that's not important. Let's get to what's really important. And we're going to find out that this woman has had 5 husbands, and the man she is fornicating with right now is not her husband. She has made some difficult decisions. And I thought, wow, how hard it is to go through a divorce, to go through rejection. Rejection's hard. Betrayal is hard. And I don't know the details of this woman. I just know she's gone through it 5 times. Can you think of somebody more broken than this woman? Hurting. And now she's continuing to make bad choices. She's with some other guy. He's not even her husband. But the thing about Jesus is very interesting. There's no lecture here. See, I want to give her a lecture. What are you thinking? What's going on here? Don't you realize you're ruining your life? Can't you think a little bit more carefully before you make these decisions? And Jesus doesn't give her a lecture. He is meek and gentle and says, what? Come unto me. You're weary, you're heavy laden, I'll give you rest. You know, you see another scene as we go through the Gospels. Here's a woman, she's anemic and she's pale. She's had a hemorrhage for 12 years. And she can't get any help. And she comes and she thinks, if I just touch the hem of his garment, that will save me. And she does it. She touches the hem of the garment, and he turns around. Who touched me? And his disciples say, well, you see all these people around you. Who touched you? Everybody's touching you. He says, no, I felt power go out. And you think that he's going to turn around to this woman and give her a little bit of a lecture. How dare you touch me? But he doesn't do that at all. He says to her, woman, it's going to be okay. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Here's a woman who's so tender. She is a broken reed. She is a smoldering wick, and he does not put her out. And one after another, as we go through these stories, the story is repeated over and over. Here's a woman caught in adultery. Here's a leper who's unclean, and he's afraid, and he can't get around people. And he wants Jesus to heal him, but he doesn't know if it's really okay to approach him. And what does Jesus do? He goes over and touches the guy. And the woman who anoints Jesus, this sinful woman, and Simon who's there, this Pharisee who's there, watches it. He says, if he knew what kind of woman this was. And Jesus asked him, Simon, do you see this woman? Well, yeah, of course he sees that woman. What are you doing with this woman? And he says, let me ask you a question. He says, there's two debtors. One owes a great deal of money, and the other one owes just a little bit, and they're both forgiven. Which one's going to love the most? He says, well, I guess the one that's forgiven the most. And he says, well, this woman, she's forgiven a lot. And that's the way she's acting because of that. You see, Jesus is this shepherd, this servant that is so tender. And the Gospels are filled with these stories of desperate people, helpless people, hopeless people, rejected people, bruised by life, so fragile and in so much pain, victims. And you can be victims, you can be hurt in so many ways, by harsh words, by somebody's anger, by betrayals, by abuse, which can be physical or emotional. And if that's not enough, you can just be hurt by your own failures. I'm discouraged by my own discouragement. I'm discouraged by myself. I'm not what I want to be. I'm not who I want to be. But I thank God I'm not who I used to be. And I praise God I'm not what I'm going to be. But I'm a disappointment to myself. I do so many things to myself, and I see people doing things to themselves, and I want to give them the lecture about, hey, make better decisions. What is God going to do with me? What's God going to do with us? And I can see these stories and say that he's going to be pretty tender with me. He's going to be gentle. One of the most unattractive aspects of human nature is that secret pleasure we just seem to derive from the failure of someone else. I mean, social media is full of that. You got my attention the other day. I saw this headline, Andy Griffith had destroyed more careers. And what? That didn't sound like him. You remember the cast of such and such a show? Look at them now. Saw one this morning. Errol Flynn was such a criminal. He did all these crimes. Thinking, whoo. And what is it about celebrities and politicians that make us gloat and make us glow that they have failed and they've not done well? And perhaps it's because by comparison it makes us feel morally superior. And we have no right to feel morally superior. A young teenage girl, she gets pregnant and she's embarrassed and she's confused. And how do we respond? Do we say, how can I help you? Or do we say, you better straighten up and you need to come forward and confess to the church. All this stuff's going on. How do we respond to that? Here's a mom wrestling with babies in worship. And we piously criticize because we can't remember what it was like when we had little kids. Or do we say, how can I help? Are somebody struggling with finances, or with addictions, or with pornography, or with food? It's too easy to become self-righteous and proud and aggressive. How many reeds? have I broken? How many smoldering wicks have I extinguished? How many have we done? Isaiah 42 gives us this picture of Jesus that is so marvelous, so tender and so gentle. And we see this in story after story in the New Testament. You know, going back to Isaiah, the 42nd chapter, verses 3 and 4, when he uses this word bruised, a bruised reed, in verse 4, he uses that same word, but it's translated crushed. And that dimly burning wick, he uses that same word, he translated disheartened. Jesus went through those things too, but he continued. He had the strength to go through because of who he was. And here we get to look at this servant. And this is the first part of the song. The second part of the song, which we don't really have time to go look at, but it speaks to the servant. God is speaking to the servant from verses 5 through 9. And then in verse 10, he says, I want you to sing a new song. Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing his praise to the end of the earth. You who go down to the sea and all that is in it, you islands and those who dwell in them. All of us, he's talking about, all of us sing a new song to him. Look what he's done for us, and we can sing some songs. A new song. You know, I like old songs. Old songs are comforting. We know the words. They're familiar. But there's something very dangerous about an old song because they're very familiar, and we sometimes don't even pay attention to what we're singing anymore. We just go through the motion. Sing a new song, he says. And sometimes, you know, that reminds us of our life. Some things in our life, we develop certain ways of living, certain ways of thinking, certain habits that we have. And we're comfortable with our old habits. They become dangerous because we don't realize just how hurtful they are to us and to others. And we need something new. We need a new song. We need a new life. And then there's one last thought before I end this morning. It's verse 14. He says, I have kept silent for a long time. I've kept still and restrained myself. Now, like a woman in labor, I will groan. I will both grasp and pant. I will lay waste the mountains and hills and wither all their vegetation. I will make the rivers into coastlines and dry up the ponds. He says, I've been holding back for a long time. But there's going to come a time when I'm going to just lay waste to everything. It says, it's like a woman in labor. You know she's going to have a baby. It's coming. And he says, it's just like that. You're going to hear the cries and the travails of labor. It's happening. You know, it's late, but it's not too late. You know how I know it's not too late? Because you're here. And maybe you're here and you've not heard the invitation. You've not come to Jesus. You've not come and responded and confessed his name. You've not been baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. You're not trying to live in newness of life. And you need to realize that it's not too late to change. But there will come a time when it will be. And Peter says that God is not slow about his promise concerning his things, but he's patient towards you, not wishing for any to perish. He doesn't want you to perish, and so he's been patient with you, waiting for you. When are you going to come? And he says, just like this pregnant woman, the time will come. And as we ponder these thoughts, one thing I want us to really focus on is, behold God's servant. Look at Jesus. There's this story of the Emperor Frederick the Great and him visiting the Potsdam prison. And as he's in the prison, prisoners were coming up to him telling them that they were innocent and they were victims of the circumstance. And in fact, nearly every prisoner was coming up and telling him that I'm innocent. I didn't do anything. I'm a victim here. And it says that there was one man over to the side. He wasn't saying anything. And finally, Frederick looked at him and said, well, what's your story? And he said, Your Majesty, I'm guilty. I am getting what I deserved. And that really surprised Frederick. That's the first time he heard that. And he called for the warden. And the warden comes. He says, I want you to take this man out of here before he infects the rest of these innocent men. Before he corrupts them. You know, justice. And he says he will bring forth justice to the nations. That's what this servant is going to bring, justice. Isn't justice one of those crazy words? Because justice, we love justice. I want justice. And we march for justice. And we want justice. Do we really want justice? Because justice means if you do the crime, you do the time. That's justice. And we've done the crime, but we don't want to do the time. We want mercy. Mercy is not getting what you deserve. And he's willing to give us mercy. Someone died for you, for your crimes, for your sin. And that's what kind of peace he brings. He says, okay, I'm going to give you a chance here. I will let you take my sacrifice and make it yours. All you have to do is come to me. I'm easy to do. A preacher, I was reading about a preacher, he's talking about his little girl, Andrea, and when she's about 4 or 5 years old, she got a splinter in her finger. So he took her into the bathroom, and he got out the tweezers and the ointment and the Band-Aid. And she said, I just want the Band-Aid, Daddy. Sometimes we just want to cover up. I'm a good person. I'm good enough. I don't think I need all this church stuff. I don't think I need God. I don't think I need Jesus. I'm good enough. No, you're guilty. And the invitation is still there. Come unto me, all you are weary and heavy laden, I'll give you rest. Confess the faith you have in him and be baptized. We haven't had the invitation like we've traditionally had in a long time because of the COVID and all, but this is one of those sermons that may demand to have an invitation to say, look, if you're ready right now, we've been talking. Sometimes we talk about people who are broken and bruised and there's barely a flicker left in life. We talk about those people, but sometimes we realize that we're talking to those people. I don't know where you're at this morning, but you have an opportunity to come and respond to Jesus' invitation and put him on in baptism this morning. If you need to respond in any way, you can do so. Let's stand and sing together.